Welcome back to the second session of our conversation with Frederick W. Smith, the founder, chairman, and CEO of the FedEx Corporation. And Fred, before our break, we were talking about the fate of the Air Cargo Deregulation Act and how the first proposal died in the House Subcommittee on Aviation at the hands of Representative Glenn Anderson. How did it happen that the legislation eventually passed in 1977? Can you recall anything about that process and your role in it, of course?
You know, Brian, I'm not 100% sure because my memory about it is not perfect. I think we had built up so much momentum in the previous year around the merits of our case and how the opposition to the air cargo sector was so antithetical to the public interest, so obvious, you know, that the opponents weren't doing what we were doing, and we were doing something that the public wanted. I think they really became a bit discredited. But much more importantly, I suspect, despite my great pride in our ability to make our argument and the merits of our case at the time, I really think it was this building tsunami of support for deregulation on the much, much bigger passenger side of the house that led people to conclude that the air cargo deregulation bill might be a good test case. So those two things converged, and then I think there was a final thing to his credit. I think the president and his administration, I'm not sure he was focused on our particular issue. In fact, I'd be surprised if that came to light that he was, but I think they were very much of that mind, that our support had merit, the opposition did not, and if it showed that it made sense in the cargo sector, it might be useful in the bigger picture.
I understand, but looking at your testimony, and as I said, I've looked at several examples of your testimony, it seems as though you were very careful at all times, until the very end, to emphasize that the regulatory system that was created for air passenger service did not serve all cargo service. That in fact, the Civil Aeronautics Board was inadequate for regulating air service cargo. Why did you make that argument? Why were you so concerned to separate the two? In fact, at one point, you said that you were extremely cautious about making any major changes for the passenger system.
Yes.
Because, you said, it works, and it works very well.
Yeah.
Testimony of Frederick W. Smith.
Well, hopefully I was smart enough when I made those comments that I didn't want to be killed by a ricochet bombshell. I did not want to be locked in to whatever arguments the passenger deregulation proponents were making. And you see in the passenger side of the house, there were just enormous differences. I mean, just a few, I'm sure these were in my testimony, and I almost recite them in my sleep. You know, passengers generally, unless something untoward happened, go both ways. Cargo almost always goes one way. Long distance transportation in the United States, even in the regulated era, had become very much the province of the airlines. The railroads had become, even then, sort of relegated to niche services. Mm-hmm. And that was not true in the cargo business. The air cargo and the air express portion of that were tiny little slivers compared to the much bigger surface transportation market. So I think all three of those reasons led us to try to put some distance between us and the cargo issue. We had plenty of enemies. We didn't need any more.
Well, some of the things you said included the following, and maybe you could comment on it. You made a distinction before Congress between what you call primary and supplementary systems. Mm-hmm. And you said air passenger is the primary system.
Well, that's what I was just referring to.
That's what you're referring to. You're saying that this is a backup to the main passenger industry.
Well, I was really talking more about the cargo industry. And the cargo industry was very much the province of trucks and rails, and the air cargo portion was just a small, very important part of it, but it was dwarfed by the much bigger business. Long distance travel in the United States had become the province primarily of the airlines as opposed to surface or trains or automobile transportation. I mean, you didn't look at driving your car from Los Angeles to Chicago as a true alternative to air transportation. But in most of the cargo business, it had to be something very extraordinary to make you want to pay the premium for moving things by air as opposed to moving it by surface. So the markets were entirely different.
Oh, so when you were referring to supplementary there, you were referring to your part of air cargo.
Cargo.
Cargo generally.
Cargo generally.
Cargo generally.
Yeah.
Because it's a point you made a number of times.
And particularly air cargo too. That it was
air cargo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's the thrust of what you were saying. You had other points connected with your industry that, for example, you talked about the fact that FedEx moved at night.
Yes.
And different times of day and so forth. Why was that important to tell Congress? What point? This was not a noise question at that time.
No, not at all.
What was your
I think we simply were trying to communicate over and over again that this regulatory regime was built around the passenger transportation market. In '38, when the original act was passed that regulated the airlines, Air Express was, for all intents and purposes, the only thing that moved by air that wasn't a person. And they were very small, very urgent things. It was the province of the airlines and generally the Railway Express Agency. And so you would move whatever it was, a lot of it were documents, very expensively on the airlines. The airlines were, of course, made viable by the airmail subsidies of the federal government until the DC-3 came along. And it's not coincidental that the DC-2 and the DC-3, the first commercially viable plane, a plane that could make money on its own without government subsidy, immediately preceded the regulation of the industry in '38.
Right. And so the bill passed, and I have the bill here, like a nostalgic view of that bill.
Yes.
Of course, it was an amendment to the Federal Aviation
Yes.
Act. It was not a bill. It wasn't actually the Air Cargo Deregulation Act as a separate act. Did you get what you wanted?
Yes, as I recall, it was a great day, and we shortly had agreed to purchase some convertible 727-100 airplanes. They were turned into all-freighter airplanes, and we had grown right past the DC-915s that we had based our exemption on. The Canadair CL-600 had become delayed due to technical issues, and inflation was running rampant, so we canceled the orders there. We kept a few of them for our corporate aviation needs, and we went right into the 727, and everything that we had predicted and all of our testimony was borne out in practice.
Jim Oberstar notwithstanding.
Jim Oberstar. I had forgotten, was he around in those days
I'm
too?
going to quote from him in a moment.
Okay, all right.
He had a little colloquy with you about what
we had many fights with Congressman Oberstar.
But before I forget, tell me about the episode you mentioned during our break when you made a pitch for what the good work was that FedEx was doing.
As I recall, we were I was testifying, I think, before Howard Cannon's committee in the Senate, and I had been searching for a way to demonstrate clearly the difference that the different types of very high priority small items that we needed to move door to door through our network to any point versus certainly the passenger business or the point-to-point air cargo operations, say Seaboard and Flying Tigers. In fact, Mr. Prescott, the legendary founder of Flying Tigers, that when he testified, it may have been the same day, it may not have been, but he kept calling us motorcycle boys. Compared to him, you know, with the big trucks and the big planes. So we were carrying a tremendous amount of medical items. It's sort of the archetypical Air Express items, and we carried a number of radioactive isotopes, and these were radioactive medicines. They weren't harmful to humans particularly, but typical of all hazardous materials, they scare the hell out of you about the stickers that you have to put on them. So I had a small box of empty that had a metal canister in it, and on all four sides was this radioactive symbol, which is universally recognized. And in the testimony or the conversation, I said, if you want to see the type of things that we carry that are so important to the public, here it is. And I took this radioactive box up and took it up to the thing, and I think about half the bench was moving backwards towards the exit, thinking that I had become crazed and this really was a radioactive device.
This was your final pitch.
Well, but it made the point, and it certainly wasn't anything that Flying Tigers was going to carry from Springfield, Illinois, where it was manufactured, to Ocala, Florida, which is what we could do, or any other traffic lane. So it made the point, and
quite well, it sounds
yeah,
like.
it did, and it was a lot of fun too. So.
Well, you know that, as I said, you were very focused in your testimony on cargo.
Yeah.
You just wanted to stay away from the passenger issue. I
Yes.
think is that a
definitely.
fair characterization?
Absolutely.
Was that, in a sense, a political concession, that you didn't want to scare other industry actors? Because the airline industry, the passenger airline industry at this time, was monolithically opposed
Yes.
to deregulation.
Yeah. Oh, no question that would have been part of our thinking, was to stay out of the bigger fight.
And what changed with regard to the passenger airlines?
Well, I think the changing moment, and bear in mind, as you know well, and the people watching this tape may or may not know, air cargo deregulation preceded air passenger deregulation by about a year. Mm-hmm. So we were more an observer of that and perfectly willing to tag along in the slipstream of the passenger deregulation, but we didn't want to get in the midst of the fight and make enemies where we didn't have to. But to me, I think the pivot point was when United Airlines, which was a very important entity to Howard Cannon, the chairman of the committee, changed its position and came out in favor of deregulation. I think that was the moment that the momentum went towards change rather than keeping the status quo.
On the passenger side?
Yes, on the passenger.
And is there any particular individual you would identify with that change?
Yeah, well, the CEO was Dick Ferris, a
Okay.
great guy, and you'd have to ask Dick exactly why he changed his thinking about it. I believe at the end of the day that they came to the conclusion that their constant quests for new routes, which were largely thwarted, and their size would allow them to compete more effectively if they didn't have to go through all this regulatory situation. But it was that turn of United, I think, that was very important. Now, I also think Senator Cannon, who paid attention to United, which provided a lot of service to his home state in Nevada, was also very mindful of Senator Kennedy's initiative over on the side, and somewhat of a competitive jurisdictional dispute.
Yeah.
And Senator Kennedy had gotten very interested in this, having studied the intrastate carriers in California and Texas. And I think Howard Cannon probably came to the conclusion that this was an idea whose time had come. And
he was on the Commerce. He was
the chair of it. Yes.
Chair of Commerce, and Kennedy was on the Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, well, I forget which committee it was, but Kennedy was definitely playing a big role in the air passenger He did not play a big role in the air cargo.
Who played the biggest role in the Senate?
Well, I think it was Howard Cannon and Glenn Anderson over in the House, and a lot of other actors that just agreed eventually that this was silly. I mean, we weren't trying to do anything that was inimical to the existing carriers, and they were just opposing us for the sake of opposition.
Do you think the passenger airlines made a tactical error in emphasizing their private interest considerations of profits and loss, gains and losses, whereas you focused for FedEx, Federal Express, all the time on the public interest? I mean, there's clear from the testimony that you looked for the public interest.
Oh, no question, Well,
they were worried about whether they were going to make any money.
Yeah, of course. Well, and most of the managements at that time, and I came to know many of them very, very well, I think most of them honestly believed that it was a business that was best suited to a regulated environment. And they'd never known anything any differently. They didn't like competition. They competed on the basis of piano bars and better seats and one thing or another. And they were worried, quite rightly so, as it turned out in retrospect, that their legacy costs were going to be difficult to manage with new carriers coming into the business. And of course, every one of them either merged or went bankrupt or both.
Yeah, well, the post-history wasn't that edifying of the air passenger side. You mentioned a number of times the academic studies that were appearing, which created an atmosphere of change.
Yes.
Although you did actually testify somewhat dismissively of academics. You said they were not reflective of the real world in their theoretical support for passenger and cargo deregulation. Do you think, looking back at the academic support, that it improved the prospects for deregulation or scared people? I mean, I suppose it's a question you ask about any constituency.
I don't remember any specific studies on the cargo side, although I'm sure there were. We may even have engendered a few of them. But on the passenger side, they were, to me, now I have a bent this way anyway, they were very persuasive, particularly Jim Miller's work on it. He had gone and studied AirCal and PSA, as I recall, and Southwest, which had actually started after the California carriers.
Yeah.
And I think he made a very persuasive case. And I think the concerns about the very powerful labor component of the cost structure of the airline industry began to become a big concern. But for whatever reason, the sentiment changed and began to favor the consumer, which we had always promoted, as opposed to the carrier.
Yes.
And I think the more they defended their parochial interests, the worse it went for them.
I suppose the fundamental theoretical point that was being made was the notion of market contestability, the idea that airline routes are naturally competitive, and that they would attract new entry if regulation was lifted.
Sure.
Was that really relevant to you in the air cargo industry?
No, not really.
Why not?
Well, again, it's a different business. I mean, we were competing against surface transportation in the main, and there was no possibility whatsoever that we were going to be able to lower our prices and go 8 times a day. In fact, we didn't have to go 8 times a day. That was one of the things, not wanting to go wingtip to wingtip. We just had to serve a market once in the evening and once in the morning and connect it to all the other markets. So the fundamental economics of the two businesses, even though they both used airplanes, were just so radically different that some of the things that applied over there didn't apply to us and vice versa.
You also, several times in your testimony, you had some motifs that you liked to present to Congress, and one of them was the 3 objectives. And this brings me back to Oberstar.
My business partners would tell you that I still do that. I'm always 3 or 5. So.
The rule of 3.
Well, I run out of fingers on 5, so occasionally I'll have a 4-point presentation.
Well, I think
generally
you could,
3.
I think you could Google this and see how many times you did this. If Google could pick up the microfiche, lower rates, expand service to more communities, no subsidies. That was your mantra.
Yeah.
Why did Congress find that so difficult to accept at various points? Oberstar questioned you on it. He said, and this is the mindset of Congress at the time, you said lower prices, better service, no question.
Yeah.
And he said,
no subsidy.
If deregulation results in higher fares, how is that going to result in lower prices? And you said in air cargo it would not result in higher fares.
Sure.
But they seem to have the sense, the members of Congress, that higher fares was the likely outcome of deregulation, of cargo deregulation. What do you
Brian,
think?
the only thing I can say to you that Congress has a demonstrated inability to understand fundamental economics. and my friend Jim Oberstar was just representative of that mindset, I would say. He then, and throughout his career, and I knew him very, very well, and we crossed swords on a number of issues, but then, privately in the main, we were, got along fine. He was always, unless he was mad at me, then that would be a different thing. But he at his heart believed regulation was the appropriate regime for transportation. I mean, he always gave the railroads fits. He never agreed with the act in '80, which gave the railroads some degree of regulatory freedom. And I just think that was his mindset.
That was his mindset, and some politicians do have mindsets.
Yeah, absolutely, no question about it. And facts, in some cases, some politicians are irrelevant.
Well, you looked askance too at Europe around this time. You testified about that you compared the Civil Aeronautics Board regulatory system to what you call the failing state-run European industries. And you mentioned Britain, and I think you mentioned France. What was on your mind at that time? Do you recall?
Well, transportation in what's now the EU went through enormous trauma because most of it had been regulated, and predictably the companies had become captive of the labor and certain interest, and they became inflexible, and they all went broke. And that was certainly true of their airlines too. The British Airlines had a string of financially failing airlines, and the National Freight Consortium was this huge lumbering entity over there, and they eventually deregulated it and allowed some consolidation, and it became logical.
Much later.
Much later. Yeah.
But you thought that had resonance for Congress?
Yes, of course.
They would have been looking at Europe as practically a communist.
Well, in many cases, hierarchy. They still do.
In many cases, they still do. Well, just some general questions to close out the discussion of air cargo deregulation. Would you say that the deregulation movement would have been possible outside its particular historical context? And by that I mean, there was that old word, stagflation, rising inflation and rising unemployment.
Yes.
Energy shocks, the popularity of University of Chicago economics.
Yes.
Jeff Shane, who I'm sure you know very well, said, in commenting on all of this, he said that deregulation, both airline, passenger and cargo, was as unlikely a public policy achievement as the ability of the bumblebee to fly is an unlikely fact of nature. Would you go along with that observation? Or is it hyperbolic?
Jeff is not a man given to hyperbole, but he's a very solid citizen, and of course occupied very high positions in transportation and had a ringside seat about a lot of this. I think he's a lawyer, was in a fine law firm too. I think it was, I don't know if it's hard as a bumblebee to fly, but the bumblebee flies, so obviously his analogy may be closer than I've ever thought. I just think that the economic milieu, or whatever you want to call it, just as you described in the late Carter years, people were very disappointed at the lack of economic growth, at the level of inflation, which was quite high. Interest rates were, 12, 14%. If you remember, Volcker came in and created the Reagan recession by giving everybody some economic castor oil and things of that nature. People were just searching for different courses, and I think that deregulation, which was spawned by the Carter administration, and remember, equally important, if not more so, was the 1980 legislation that came on the heels of air cargo and air passenger deregulation that deregulated interstate surface transportation and gave the rails some freedom in the form of the Staggers Act. Now, 1994, a full 14 years later, 16 years after passenger deregulation, 17 years after air cargo deregulation, the federal government actually preempted state regulation of surface transportation.
Of trucking. I'd like to come back to that, actually.
Yeah, because they recognized that there really wasn't any more state trucking. It was all interstate commerce, and the federal government's primacy should prevail. Those things have had a profound effect on the prosperity of the United States. And when you talk about surface transportation, we can talk about this some more, but far beyond what the average citizen understands. And were the root cause of some of the biggest innovations that the country has seen. So all of this is part of a whole and a changed mindset to let markets prevail rather than regulation. And I think it was an idea whose time had come. I mean, maybe it was as hard to get done as a bumblebee flying, but I think there were a lot of people that were coming around to that point of view.
Right. So in fact, it's actually interesting that we can close our discussion with that observation, because it seems to me that what was on trial in those hearings, where you testified so many times, wasn't in fact the responsiveness or the efficacy of the regulatory system. It was the very necessity of regulation.
You have hit the nail squarely on the head, Professor. That was the whole focus of my testimony, that this is something very much in the public interest. And as I demonstrated in the radioactive isotope, sometimes all the way up to a life and death matter, where you had an operation that wouldn't be performed. And today, here you are later, FedEx at a close to $50 billion corporation and moving, tens of millions of items, and the same things are true. I mean, we are at the heart of this, and it's inconceivable that many of the things that we do and the people who depend on us would have been able to do them absent this regulatory.
You could not exist today but for this.
Well, it's not just us. Walmart couldn't exist. Amazon.com couldn't exist. I mean, you can go down the list. And the most important thing is the fantastic improvement in national productivity that was permitted. The cost of an air ticket in real terms is fantastic relative to many other goods and services, because it's come down due to deregulation.
Well, just to close from your testimony, you said on the joint hearings before the Subcommittee on Investigations and Review of the Aviation House Committee on Public Works, there is no mechanism within the regulatory apparatus as it now exists for prompt relief from the problems that regulation creates for the Federal Express business model. So there wasn't any point in regulatory reform. It had to be deregulated.
That's what we finally concluded after our failed attempt to get the exemption.
Was that the final hurdle to realize your business concept?
No, we needed the companion deregulation of surface transportation to complete it. And then finally, as the world evolved, a more liberal global regime.
Trucking deregulation. I didn't know very much about trucking deregulation until I started researching for this interview, because I always thought it had nothing to do with aviation, but it has everything to do with aviation.
It's exactly the same.
I'm not sure that but for Federal Express, there would actually have been trucking deregulation. Tell me about the involvement of FedEx in bringing about the Motor Carrier Act of 1980.
Well, again, I think we were not a sideshow, very much a proponent, but we weren't the driving force that we became in the air cargo deregulation movement. I think what really pushed surface transportation deregulation, trucking deregulation, were the retailers that were becoming more and more frustrated that they were unable to run their businesses logically. They were having to accumulate inventory that they didn't need in places where they didn't want it to be, and they needed a more flexible logistics system. The country was migrating to the Southwest, Florida, and to the Pacific in these routes, just like the airlines had. These trucking organizations couldn't meet their needs. So I think the impetus for surface deregulation was much more the business community as a whole, that this was a choke point, and they could see how silly it was up close and personal, so to speak. Now, we were certainly in favor of it.
Well, you had to deal with some really strange anomalies. For example, the service zones surrounding airports.
Yeah, that was bizarre.
You had permission to move trucks 70 miles ultimately. It was 25 miles, then 70. But you could go no further. After that, you had to get an ICC certificated carrier. So this must have been...
In many ways, it was more Byzantine than the air transportation system. Some years back, they had exempted the zone 25 miles around an airport or the contiguous metropolitan area. So we could pick up and deliver in what looked like these amoebic patterns around Tulsa or Chicago or what have you. And outside of that, just as you say, we were prohibited from picking up and delivering things, and we had to deal with an ICC regulated carrier. I mean, it was just silly.
Who were those carriers? Who would you be dealing with?
I remember there was one in the Memphis area called Film Transit, and Film Transit had an ICC certificate to carry movie reels, you know, to the movie theater in Greenwood, Mississippi. So, and they could also carry other commodities, and some commodities they couldn't carry.
Oh, so you had to pick your carrier depending on the commodity.
Yeah, in many cases.
In many cases.
Yeah, as I said, it was much more Byzantine. Like it would have been like the airline industry saying, if you're an Irishman, you can only fly on Chicago, on United or what have you. It made airline deregulation look tame in comparison.
I'm afraid to ask you who carried the radioactive isotopes.
You know, part of the problem was that the regulatory regime simply didn't recognize the changes in technology. I don't think when the ICC was put together, the Interstate Commerce Committee to regulate trucking, anybody even knew what radioactive was, much less how to carry it. So the efficiency of the economy overall being driven by the business community, which was a powerful force to deregulate trucking in 1980.
Okay, and you had a choice between legislatively extending the terminal exemption for all ground shipments that were incidental to air transport, or full deregulation, which would actually have allowed you to get out of the shipment by air business where you needed to.
Yeah.
So you didn't get that. You didn't get full deregulation at that point. In fact, I think it took on in 1995.
Four, I think. No, 4.
94.
Maybe it was 95.
Well, the act was 94, and then it took effect in 95.
Yeah.
So, but interstate trucking continued, as you pointed out earlier, to be regulated by the states.
Yeah.
And there was a case, a famous case, where the California Court of Appeals struck that down as being a violation of being preempted by the Airline Deregulation Act.
Yeah.
You may recall that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you then went state to state and started to
Well,
try
we
to
not only
dismantle.
went state to state, we also bought the regulatory authorities of Railway Express from the trustee in bankruptcy of Railway Express. They had a nationwide authority to move these unusual critical items outside these deregulated zones around airports, and that's why we bought it. And that's how so at one time we were deregulated on the air side, and we were deregulated if we picked up and delivered close to the Chicago O'Hare, but we could use the REA authority elsewhere if we needed it. Now, events overwhelmed that, and subsequently the Congress preempted state regulation of truck transportation.
What's interesting is that came about in part because you were litigating and in part because you were advocating for legislation.
Yeah.
I don't know if I think you were the plaintiff in the case in California.
We might have been.
Circuit.
Yeah,
I think so.
probably
California
If we weren't, we were a friend. We filed an amicus.
Against the Public Utilities Commission. I think you were. So you had that litigation going on, but you were also pressing for legislation.
Yeah, definitely. As were many other people.
And do you remember how that legislation came about? It was a provision in the Federal Aviation Administration Act of 1994.
Yeah.
The airport funding law.
Right.
Who put that in there? And
that I can't remember, but I'm sure we were right in the middle of suggesting the legislative remedy. But there was widely recognized after the 1980 trucking deregulation, it had huge efficiency effects on the economy. And let me give you some numbers that really astound people.
Okay.
When the deregulation effort began, and I'm speaking now about 1980, the trucking deregulation, because it's so much bigger than air cargo or air express. Logistics costs in the United States were a little over 16% of the economy. And by the time all of this washed through the system, by the time you came into the start of this century, they were down to about 9%. So you had 7 cents out of every dollar that was there to increase Medicaid, Medicare, or put into corporate profits, and it was right at the heart of a number of these innovations that we all take for granted now, like Walmart or Amazon.com or FedEx or many. I could keep going on and on. So the reality of the world prevailed over the regulation-oriented mindset.
The regulation-oriented mindset. And in effect, this trucking deregulation was a byproduct then of a concerted legislative effort by you and others to provide relief from state trucking regulation for air services.
Yes, and the reason that it was overwhelmed by the reality of the situation was because of the Constitution. And the Constitution, one of the most broad-minded things that the Founding Fathers did was to establish federal preeminence over interstate commerce.
Yes.
Had they not, you would have seen, I'm sure, the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Illinois setting up toll booths, and if you wanted to come in and trade in Illinois from Kentucky, you would have had to pay a modest fee, and the cobblers in Moline would have been very adamant that it was contrary to the public interest for cobblers from Iowa to come trade. And so the Interstate Commerce Clause was used to eliminate state regulation of trucking and air transportation because it wasn't intrastate in nature.
Right,
we were just moving things that were produced all over the world, much less the United States, prior or subsequent to their being put on an airplane.
Exactly. But it's interesting that, in fact, the byproduct of all of this, as I said, is that the Airline Deregulation Act preempted the intrastate trucking activity, and it was done for the air carriers. Initially, but it spread then. It could have been narrowly tailored.
It could have.
Express carriers, for example.
Yes.
But it became an absolute nationwide deregulation.
Yeah.
You had some opposition, though. You had, when you were trying to deregulate cargo, you had what you called sometimes hysterical opposition from passenger airlines. That's the quote from one of your testimonies.
It was hysterical. It was silly.
Well, maybe I should ask you what you meant by hysterical opposition. I know it's backtracking a little bit.
I mean, some of the nonsense that some of these lobbyists and all would come up with, I don't even remember, but you know that if you were deregulated, you know, you would be taking life in hand if you got on a plane, you know, that there'd be some crazed pilot, you know, for some fly-by-night outfit. I guess we were fly-by-night, but it was
literally, yes.
Yeah, but it was just so over the top that it
Well, Mike Levine referred to the unleashing of elemental forces, and he got a lot of nasty letters and punches in the street.
Mike had the tendency to with a rapier wit, to sometimes stick that sword into some people, wound some people. Yeah.
But you had opposition from the American Trucking Association and from the Teamsters.
Sure, of course.
This for trucking deregulation. Do you want to comment on that, or that was one of the issues that
in
surfaced?
Trucking deregulation, the 1980 Act was similar to air passenger deregulation. We were a strong proponent. We were, I think, a good advocate. We were a great example of the misguided effects of regulation, but we certainly weren't the driving force that we had been in the air cargo sector, and maybe became, in, as I think about it in retrospect, in the federal preemption of state regulation.
Okay.
So the Teamsters were definitely against it because they represented the employees of many of these regulated surface carriers. So just like the Airline Pilots Association and the IAM had been against airline deregulation, the Teamsters were against surface deregulation.
Well, before we move to some discussion of international air transport and air cargo transport, I wanted to take one other regulatory issue which I know has interested you. And at one point in 1986, you testified to Congress that no other issue is more crucial or more significant for us and our very able competitors, you said generously, than this issue of noise.
Yes.
And I'd like to talk about that issue for a few minutes as we close this session. Obviously, there's been some interesting legislative history in the United States with regard to noise. Were you involved in any efforts to bring about that kind of change? For example, clearly not the 1968 amendment of the Federal Aviation Act, which first gave the FAA the power to regulate noise considerations. But what about the Noise Control Act of 1972, which preempted local regulation? Probably not there either.
No.
But then came the Aircraft Noise and Capacity Act of 1990.
Oh yeah,
which did have some interesting benefits.
Heavily
for FedEx.
Involved in that. Yes.
You want to talk about that?
Well, I think I probably testified, or FedEx probably testified. I certainly know, talking about Jim Oberstar, he was right in the middle of it. One of the things that we did was to put a provision in the act which allowed the quietening of engines to meet the standards, rather than having the act require you to completely impair perfectly good airplanes. And we in fact developed a hush kit, which we sold to other carriers as part of that. So we were definitely involved in it. That was much more of an issue that was driven by airports and people who live around airports. So the revolution of rising expectations was pushing the people that made airplanes and the people that operated them to make them operate more quietly.
But you were looking at, around the time that the 1990 Act became a possibility, you were looking for a uniform national noise policy.
Yes.
You were concerned about the fact that there was a patchwork of local regulations, as there still is in Europe, of course.
There is, and that is
and no federal preemption in Europe.
Yes.
It's a real problem.
Well, there isn't, but there was an agreement which Europe signed with the rest of the world, or they certainly did with the United States. I think it's under IATA, that said that, I can't remember the exact term, that says it will be dealt with on a EU basis and not on a local basis. Now that's been breached in practice, but that was the agreement.
Part of the U.S.-EU negotiations, I think.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has definitely been breached in practice, and it's had profound effects. DHL had a big hub in Brussels, and they had to move to eastern Germany, to Leipzig, relocate their hub. Probably the reason we're in Paris, Charles de Gaulle, is because Amsterdam put a curfew in place. So it has been dealt with on a local basis in Europe more than has been the case in the United States, because, as you correctly noted, it was federally preempted.
Federally preempted, but at the same time, it would have been possible for the FAA, pursuant to its powers, to create curfews and noise limits and allow those to occur in local airports. It didn't do that. The approach it took was that once aircraft in stage 2 had been eliminated, stage 3 aircraft could not be subject to local restrictions.
Sure.
Isn't that the approach that was taken?
That was the trade-off.
That was the trade-off.
If you could get to stage 3, then you could operate. If you couldn't, you couldn't.
Right, so, and you got the benefit, FedEx got the benefit of some kind of performance versus design-based measure of compliance through the hush kits.
Exactly.
Which the Europeans hated.
Yes, they did, and I think we had some 727s with the hush kits in Europe. No, we actually had some airplanes in Europe that had been re-engined. We had 15 airplanes, as I recall. We had actually put on the larger fanned JT8 derivative, and we used those in Europe. They still hated them. They just didn't like the JT8.
Well, if you recall, it all went to ICAO, actually.
Yeah.
It became quite a...
Well, and the other thing is, there was some merit to it, because the JT8 engine, which was a low bypass jet engine, like the Rolls Royce that was on the back 111, that was just incredibly loud. The Spey, I think, or I can't remember the terminology. They had a very unpleasant sound. They were rumble, you know. Whereas the high bypass ratio fans that came in the later airplanes, like the 737-300s and 400s, or the wide bodies, they had a big fan where a lot of the power was produced by compressed air rather than by burning kerosene, so they were more fuel efficient, but they had a completely different noise profile. It was more like a sewing machine, you know. Zzz. And the Europeans in particular, but a lot of other people, just didn't want the JT8 to survive.
Yeah.
And so the hush kit, or the re-fanned version of the JT8, which was the power plant on the MD-80, the last of the DC-9 lineage, attempted to address that, but they still made more noise than the fan jets.
Right. It's an interesting issue, isn't it? Because Congress seems to have supported the position you took and passed this legislation. The opposite occurred in Europe. With regard to airline deregulation, you could say that the consumer certainly benefited, but the consumer is a diverse and somewhat marginal entity compared to all of the concentrated effort put in by the airlines, and who are really the losers in cost, I suppose, through this initiative. But here with noise, you have very concentrated constituencies like local airports and local citizens who in fact are not listened to by Congress. Congress takes the view that this time they will benefit the larger airline industry. Is that a fair characterization?
No, I don't think it's. I think it's mischaracterizes a little bit, Brian.
I'm just quoting from our authors.
No. I understand.
I'm not taking that position.
Well, here's my view of that. I think the Congress listened very carefully to people. I think they looked at it as I mentioned, a local issue, and this is except for supersonics, who make lots of noise when they're at cruise. But the only people that were bothered by airplane noise were the people who lived around airports.
Yes.
Many of whom moved to a location around an airport long after it was an airport. So there wasn't universal sympathy for a lot of the more strident people. There also, I think in the United States, much more in Europe, is always a bent to try to accommodate commercial interest as well as individual interest. So they crafted, I believe, a pretty good compromise. Mm-hmm. They said, if you can meet these limits,
yep.
You can show dramatically that the number of people affected by noise was going down just in terms of the geographic footprint of the more modern engines and airplanes. So they took the point, well, we're not going to shut the air commerce of the United States down because you moved to an airport, and oh, by the way, 90% of the people that used to hear an airplane don't even hear it anymore.
Yeah. So
it wasn't that they just ceded to the commercial interest and the local interests were ignored. They made, I think, a pretty thoughtful compromise, and each generation of planes and engines get quieter and quieter. And sort of the archetypical version of this is the population around London. In fact, many of the airplanes are certificated to this London standard, and the new generation of the 747, the Dash 8 model, compared to the original 747-100, I think if you draw a map around London Heathrow, it's incredible the amount of noise that was made by the 747 40 years ago versus the one today.
Well, the Europeans, Fred, as you probably know, have said that they will concede preemption of noise at local airports if the United States will concede ownership and control of U.S. airlines. Yeah. That's the deal struck in the US-EU agreement, which we'll come back to, among other issues, as we wind up in our third session.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.